What's up friends, my name is Jess. Welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be doing something a little bit different because we're not just going to be talking about books today. We're going to be talking about a TV show too. And before we get into anything, I do want to give a disclaimer. I am not like a TV film aficionado or anything like that. I don't really know how to talk about TV or film. So this isn't going to be a deep, super good analysis, but it will be an analysis of some sort. Basically, I just want to share my thoughts because I read Anxious People by Fredrik Backman at the end of last year, and I ended up watching the TV show that I think is it on Amazon? No, the show is on Netflix. I ended up watching the show earlier this year, and I thought it was really interesting the changes that were made from one medium to the other, and I just wanted to talk about how the two compare and how they are different and whether or not I agree with the changes that were made for the sake of the TV show. But before I get into the comparison of the book and the TV show, which will involve spoilers, I wanted to give you a spoiler-free summary and review of the book. So Anxious People is a comedic story where a person attempts to rob a bank and ends up running away from the police into an apartment viewing and taking 8 people hostage. The book opens up at the end of the story where the would-be robber has vanished into thin air, and we slowly work our way backwards in the story to figure out what exactly happened and who these people are. I gave this book 4 stars. I'm a huge fan of Fredrik Backman's writing style, and one day I'll know how to accurately describe it, but today I'm just going to throw out some words there that I think about when I think of his style. So humorous, quirky, snarky, satirical sometimes. I don't know, it's a writing style that I'm not very good at describing, but I love it, and I am so happy anytime that I see it. On the surface level though, this book is kind of absurd. The people say and do absurd things, and it's funny if that's your sense of humor, but the more you read this story, the more you see of humanity, in my opinion. Which is kind of lofty wording to call it a look at humanity, but I do think this book kind of shows humanity at its most simplest level. You get to see these people's fears and griefs and regret, and above all, you get to see their compassion, which is the main message of this entire story, to be compassionate to others and to understand that everybody's going through their own struggles. I thought it was a very touching story that showed how people who do bad things are not necessarily bad people, but just a product of their circumstances, that bad conditions can push a person to do these bad things. Anyway, I was entertained, I was emotional. I very much loved seeing how all of the characters in this book tied together because there were some very complex, serendipitous connections between the characters. So if this sounds interesting to you at all, I would definitely give it a try. And if you've already read the book and you liked it, I would definitely give the TV show a try, although I wouldn't get your hopes up for a perfect adaptation. One warning though, the show is in Swedish, so if you don't like having to read subtitles on shows, you're shit out of luck. And now onto the comparison. The rest of this video is intended for people who have consumed this story in either medium and so know the general plot. I am going to try to remain vague about any major plot differences, but I'm also not going to hold back on spoilers because I will be pointing out specific things that are different from one to the other. Let's start with the plot. Generally, more things got added than got removed. Jack's sister, who struggles with addiction, is only briefly mentioned in the book, but she does show up in the adaptation. And personally, I really liked the change. I think it really fleshed out Jack and his father, who had like the least developed backstory in the show and the least resolution for his personal conflict. Resolution, I think, is what the show does very well. If I'm remembering correctly, because I will admit I did not reread the book, the show continues on after the story in the book finishes. It's almost like epilogue-y scenes at the end where the characters go on about their lives after the events of the whole hostage taking and whatnot, but it's only a teeny bit. I personally really liked the scenes. I liked seeing everything tied up a little bit more, but don't expect like a whole extra hour of story or anything like that. That's more than you're gonna get. We also get a little bit more about the man who jumped off the bridge, but that's mostly because his story has kind of been tweaked. In the book, Zara's therapist provides a link between 2 different characters. However, in the show, the therapist is removed, which is actually a choice that I wasn't a huge fan of because I really appreciated seeing someone go to therapy and work on their mental health in popular media, although that we all know that was not Zara's intention in going to therapy. But regardless, the therapist was removed from the show, which means that link that existed between those 2 characters was also removed. Things had to be tweaked a little bit to create another link between them that would be just as complex and emotional. Personally, with the man that jumped off the bridge, I didn't really like the changes. It's not a big deal. It didn't detract from my enjoyment of the show, but I much preferred like the simplicity and straightforwardness of the book. Overall, the structure of the plot is a little bit different, but fundamentally it's the same. My only gripe about the changes though is that we didn't get the reason behind the fireworks in the show, which was a bummer because I was ready to get really emotional. I adored that backstory to the fireworks, but no, didn't happen, so But let's move on to characterizations now. The characterizations are a bit off in the show. They're not a huge deal. It's more a matter of toning down the exaggerated comical personalities in the book. Annalena, for example, comes off as less silly and ditzy, which I didn't really like, because that means the whole reveal of her being a highly qualified professional just isn't as impactful and cool to see on the TV, but I could live with that. The one characterization that I truly did not like was that for some reason in the first couple episodes, Jack and his father Jim have like switched personalities. In the show, Jim is the one who refuses to call Stockholm and wants to handle the case themselves, whereas Jack is the one who immediately wants to call, which to me does not line up at all with Jack's determination to prove himself. So one, why did they swap the personalities? But also two, why did this swap not even line up with the motivation that they gave Jack in the show regardless? And this whole swap changes the perspective on some of the actions that Jim takes in the beginning. Because in the book, Jim does some things that lays the foundation for how much his son means to him and for the fact that he prioritizes his family. Those actions are either missing in the show or they're twisted around because of said mischaracterization. However, this swap only lasts like a few episodes and then the personalities are swapped back appropriately. Honestly, it was more confusing than it was damaging to my enjoyment. I don't understand why it did that. Let's just move on to themes, okay? The themes in both mediums are the same and I think they're portrayed very similarly. The biggest message in my opinion is compassion, understanding that everyone has their own story and having the capacity to forgive them and give them a chance to redeem themselves. There is an idea of moving forth with your life despite your fears and your worries, dare I say despite being anxious, and I think both of those themes are delivered pretty much equally between the mediums. Although in the show I think you get more of a taste of the hopeful redeeming side of it because you do have those epilogue-y scenes that I think don't necessarily act as catharsis so much as they represent the aftermath of said catharsis. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's how those scenes felt to me. Oh, and the added sister plotline does push forward that idea of forgiveness more than the book did. Right, and the last category that I'm going to be talking about is just vibe. Will you get the same feeling while watching the show or reading the book? And in my opinion, no, you will not. Of course, the biggest thing missing is the way that Fredrik Backman writes, which to me is the biggest appeal to his stories. He writes in such a comedic, almost absurd way where very silly things are said very matter-of-factly, which results in a book that on its surface level is very funny and entertaining, therefore providing a very stark contrast to the underlying sad story and emotional themes. I think the show did its best. It had some comedy to it, but in general, it kind of just fell flat to me. It felt more weird and forced. Honestly, had I not read the book beforehand, I would have been very confused by the humor in the show, and I would have thought that the writers were just trying too hard and missing the mark every single time, which is not how it comes across in the book because Fredrik Backman knows what he's doing. He knows how to make this kind of humor work. The show is just more serious, and in all fairness, I understand why. It completely makes sense. It's harder to make the juxtaposition of comedy and super sad topics like suicide and custody battles work in a medium with much less words, especially with a limited series, because I think the show is only 6 episodes and that's it. So I don't blame them for dialing it down. I do still think it was possible to do, but I get it. It just kind of resulted in like the biggest disappointment out of all of the changes for me, which is not to say that I was disappointed with the adaptation as a whole. I liked the show. The good outweighs the bad in this case. I would recommend watching the adaptation if you liked the book, and vice versa, of course. And if you'll allow me to get sappy for a minute, the thing that I loved the most is that I was able to share this story that I very much loved with my partner, who doesn't really read but does watch TV shows and movies with me every single night. I'm happy with what they gave us. Could have been better, but I'm happy with it. And that's the comparison I have for you. Again, not super deep analytical or anything like that, but I'm just sharing with you what I would want to know if I was considering watching an adaptation or reading a book of an adaptation. If there's something that I missed that you would really want to know in a comparison of book versus show or movie, please let me know. I'm happy to add another category if that's what y'all want to see. And if there's a specific adaptation that you want me to watch and do a comparison of, also let me know that in the comments. I will see you in the next one.